Hello and welcome to another Aston Originals podcast from Aston History. I'm Brian Sudlow, lecturer in history at Aston University, and I'm joined today by Dr Valeria Vanesio from the University of Malta. Valeria, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. Such an honor. Hello, everyone.
Now, you are from the University of Malta, but in fact, you're currently in Italy, which is where you were born and grew up. How is everything there? You're in southern Italy.
It's a beautiful place. Apulia, exactly, is my region in southern Italy, but it's crazily hot. So it's quite, 42 degrees today.
42 degrees, heavens above. I'm not sure it's ever been 42 degrees in Britain. Maybe I think we touched 40 degrees last year. Anyway, well, look, stay cool, stay indoors until later on. So, Valeria, thank you very much for joining us today. I should tell people watching that Valeria is in fact an expert in archives. And especially in the archives of the Order of Malta, which is one of the grandest institutions to come out of the Mediterranean. Began in the Middle Ages. It's still going today. The Order of Malta, a religious institution with a vocation for healthcare, and that's particularly one of the themes that we'll want to pick up in this podcast. The connection between the Order of Malta and healthcare, but also then Valeria's work within the archives themselves, because archives are a different world, and they're a very special world for historians and actually for wider society, because they help us step into those other worlds that are represented by the histories that we need to tell. So, Valeria, as I say, thank you for joining us. Let's before we get into the story of the Order of Malta and the archives of the Order of Malta, let's hear a little bit about your story. You're from Apulia in southern Italy, you said.
Yes, I'm from Apulia, from a very small town called Maglie in the province of Lecce. And I actually started my studies with a bachelor degree in cultural heritage in the University of Lecce, with a specialization already, a focus on archives and libraries. Since I was a child, I was surrounded by books. I loved history and documents, especially old documents. Very fascinated by them. So I immediately decided after my lyceum, my high school, to join this particular bachelor in cultural heritage. Provided me a wide range of information about history, history of art, literature, and also archives and libraries. And I discovered there my passion.
And I mean, if one's going to study history, Italy is the place to do it, right? I mean, you're in a sense, Italy is intimately tied up to the cultural origins of Europe itself.
Yes, it's a fascinating place, and especially Rome, where I decided then to move after my bachelor degree. It was the starting point of a new adventure, the best place to study about archival history and library history, especially. And yes, every corner is just, embedded in history. And for me, it was like truly an adventure moving from Apulia to Rome then for my master and my PhD as well. And then I moved to study archival and library science at Sapienza University for my master, and then also for my PhD research. And since the beginning, I just met for the first time the Order of St. John through my university, especially for my master's studies. And I fell in love with the history of this institution, and of course, within the history of the city as well, Rome itself, of course.
Just before we get into that story of your discovery of their archives, what is it about archives and institutions? Why are they so important for institutions, for the memories that institutions need?
Absolutely. Archives are essential, not only for the history of the institution itself, but also for the running, the administrative aspect of an institution, the legal ones. So archives are, we look at archives as archivists from a different perspective. Now we look mostly at the context of in which a document is produced. No? And archives can tell you also different stories. No, they are not always just a mirror of the institution. They also tell you as an historian, no? Which kind of how the institution wanted to transmit its own memory, to shape it. So archives are in one way, let's say, a parallel history of the institution as well, sometimes intertwined. Sometimes they can take a different pathway as well from the original creator. And at the same time, while they are created also for administrative and legal reasons, so they can explain a lot about the history of the institution itself from this point of view. So they are on one side the memory and the identity of them, of institutions, and on the other side, and also communities, of course, all the communities and the people involved in the fascinating history of this production and preservation, sometimes destruction also of these documents. On the other side, they are, the testament of the activities of these institutions and communities as well. So it's extremely important to look at them from different perspectives. And ours as archivists, again, it's quite unique. We look at the history of the documents and not just at the informative value and contents of them. We look at the context mostly. So we provide a different understanding, let's say, of the institutional history in this way.
Archives are fascinating. Archives can be very personal, very I often have the feeling when I'm in an archive of being able to be in contact with the historical actors whose papers or letters I might be looking at. But can't archives also be a little bit dangerous for institutions as well?
Absolutely, because they are the proof and the evidence of the activities of these institutions. So it all depends. They are a tool of power. So how they are used can be very dangerous as well, no? Or if they are neglected, neglecting your own memory can be very dangerous as an institution as well. So especially then we will see through the history of the order, what I learned is that when an institution undertakes major transformations and changes, looking at the archive, and all as a tool of power, but also as a testament of your own identity, always helped the order, at least, and many other institutions, of course, in the due course of history, to change in a certain direction instead of another, to recover certain aspects of the identity and to adapt to a new world at the same time. So they are a tool of power. And beside historical archives, our archives today, contemporary archives, they are embedded in power, totally. There are institutional narratives imposed on archives as well. There are silences in the archives that it is our duty as well to fill in a way, to fill in the gap, to also invite underrepresented communities, for example, to preserve memory of themselves, communities that sometimes are underrepresented by the institutional narratives in the archives. So there are so many aspects around archives as well that we can discuss about. They are definitely very, very, very powerful in the positive and also in a negative way. Depends how they are used or not used.
I think I absolutely, and I think as well they can be powerful just within historiography, just within overturning histories that get written, which perhaps haven't engaged with certain archival materials. So there are many cases where the histories have had to shift because new documents have been discovered, or maybe new documents have been accessed. Perhaps previous historians didn't have the languages to look at particular archives. And I mean, hopefully we'll come to that point about the Order of Malta archives, the fact that they're multilingual in nature, aren't they? Let's come to that. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Go ahead.
Oh no, I fully agree, and would like, beside the individual skills of the historians or the users approaching the archives, another big problem is that in many countries we are understaffed, for example, as information professionals, and this means that we cannot provide the right accessibility by cataloging these records. There are records, for example, again of the Order, but many others scattered all around Europe that are just uncatalogued. So for this reason, they are unknown. And if they are unknown, historiography up to now, for example, Hospitalleri's, the Order's historiography, was written based on just certain documents and on documents that were, unfortunately, as we will see, rearranged in a wrong way or according to outdated criteria. So, heightening, in a way, part of the history. So, yeah, it's all to be rediscovered.
Yeah. Indeed. So let's come to the Order of Malta. Let's take a step back into the Middle Ages and tell us something about this order that you discovered in the course of your postgraduate work.
Yes, well, the Order is a millenary institution anymore. Extremely fascinating just because of this. But we need to understand that the Order was born with as a lay confraternity, first of all, in the 11th century Jerusalem, immediately before the First Crusade. And it was born as a lay fraternity of probably merchants. We still don't know about the origins so well. Probably merchants who moved to Jerusalem near the Abbey of St. Mary of the Latins to build an hospital. And in this hospital, their mission was to take care of the poor and sick, especially the pilgrims going to Jerusalem. So originally, this lay fraternity that turned into an order only a little bit later with the approval of the rule of this religious order then, had this main mission. And what it is very fascinating to me, the order still exists today, as we discussed before a little bit, in a different legal vest. It is very fascinating to me is the continuity of this mission, this caring mission, not taking care of poor and sick people in general. And this was the beginning of this.
And that was the beginning of the institution. I think it might just be worth dwelling on this. When we say the word hospital, we think of a sort of a clinical, clean building, sort of slightly smelling of bleach and antibacterial fluid and so on, and operating perhaps under great pressure. But of course, this kind of an institution then has been around for hundreds of years.
Oh yes. And not only in Jerusalem, then they moved different seats, as we will see, but in Malta, they built one of the largest, if not the largest, hospital in the early modern age in all over Europe. So it was a kind of, such an institution, it's a millenary institution. The history of the order, it's full of fractures and continuities. And this is the reason why it's so fascinating. And also it's one of the it's a privileged perspective to study the history of Europe and also the Mediterranean basin in general. But one of the elements of continuity was this, still up to today, the caring mission. So we have to understand that this first hospital was very small. It was not independent because it was related to this abbey of St. Mary of the Latin, but it started gaining, donations, for example, from different, sovereigns and powers all around the Latin states in the Levant and also in Europe. So it grew in a way in those first 2 centuries. And then with the, of course, in 1187, when Jerusalem was conquered, the order had to move as well. It was an order, a military religious order, because in the meantime, the knights, called them knights then, also acquired this military aspect for obvious reasons, not to defend also their own properties, the hospital, and also the pilgrimage itself, in line with the other religious military orders, like the Templars, for example, the most famous ones, let's say. And so then they moved out of Jerusalem, first in Acre, then in Cyprus, and then finally in 1310 in Rhodes, so beginning of the 14th century. And Rhodes meant for the order the first territorial stability in a way. Also in Rhodes, they had, of course, an extensive hospital, and they, of course, took care of their own mission, no? Even if, from an institutional point of view, they were changing, completely changing their own, nature to adapt to a new context after the loss of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. So again, it's very fascinating. And then when they moved to Malta in 1530, because they lost, unfortunately, Rhodes because of an Ottoman attack, Malta meant for the order, let's say, a new beginning again after years of peregrination between the loss of Rhodes and the acquisition of Malta that was granted by Charles V as a feudo franco et libero, so a free place where to build the order again and defend the Christianity at that time. And
Charles V, that's the Holy Roman Emperor. I think was he the uncle or the grandfather of Catherine of Aragon, who was the wife of Henry VIII, right? So we're in that period of history, just on the eve of the Reformation.
Of the Reformation, absolutely. That had quite of an impact as well on the order, of course. And so the order in Malta built this very, very large hospital called the Sacra Infermeria, the Holy Infirmary, where they used to cure not only members of the order. There were sections of the infirmary also dedicated to slaves, to providing care and therapies to slaves. They were very much advanced with surgery and other typologies of therapies. And I would like to share as well a curiosity. The hospital was very well organized. I studied very much the administration behind it, of course, the documentary aspect of it, not the results in records and documents. But there is an amazing, I think, detail that I would like to show. We know from some records that the main ward of the hospital was huge. It's still in place, even if it was partially reconstructed after the Second World War in Malta. This ward was divided with different beds, and these beds had their own curtains on top, and the knights used to use colors on those curtains to identify different, for example, illnesses, in order to subdivide the main ward in different sections according to the particular illness they had to cure, for example. And it looks like, purely decoration. It is not. This is pure administration, how to run such an institution so big and so, diversified as well, because, again, they were able to cure many of the diseases of that time. So this is quite fascinating as well.
Absolutely. So in fact, again, we tend to think about medicine, disease control, this sort of thing as much later developments in medical history, but there's clearly there a triage of illnesses or injuries, and presumably then treatment protocols that follow on from that triage as well. You've just walked us through about 400 years of the history of the Order of Malta. I imagine in those 400 years, there would have also been the slow accumulation of records and deposits of information that was important for the administration of the order, perhaps communications between members of the order and between the central offices of the order and so on. So, what kinds of documents are found there in the archives? Tell us a little bit about what is actually there.
Sure. This is another element of continuity in the history of the order. No, of course, not only producing and accumulating, but also bringing as much as possible, its own archives while moving so many different seats. So the Knights always try to recover as much as possible their documents, to bring them with them, actually. And this happened also after Malta, as we will see in a few seconds. Well, being a military and religious order, of course, there are many different records, very, very interesting as well. We have privileges, for example, granted by sovereigns and emperors we have correspondence, especially, letters, diplomatic letters, for example, related to the activity of the ambassadors of the order that, especially from the 16th century, were, located in different, key cities of Europe as well. There are, for example, land surveys or land registers, because the order was, yes, at its own headquarter called convent, the main convent, in, again, Jerusalem, then Acre, Cyprus, Rhodes, and Malta. But in the meantime, since they received a lot of donations all around Europe of lands and, and immovable and movable properties, they had to manage all of these properties and members as well at distance. So they put in place a lot of different archival procedures, and one of them is also used by other religious orders, is the land survey or land register. So it's basically a register testifying all the privileges and the properties of the order in a particular place, usually called commentary or preceptory. And these documents are very fascinating. They basically tell us the history of lands and properties in Europe. All of these properties of the order were scattered all over Europe. These commentaries and these priories, these administrative subdivisions in the peripheral areas of the order, let's call it like this. And another very important document was, of course, the proof of nobility. Now, just to put our public in the right frame of mind, the order, of course, also had some requirements of nobility for the aspirant knights who wanted to join the institution. And to prove these particular requirements, the aspirant knight needed to submit a certificate of baptism or marriages of the families, the four families, the different family quarters, genealogical trees, memories of these families, accounts of the history of their own families, and also hand-painted coat of arms. And usually these documents, called proofs of nobility, originated an amazing archival procedure involving different powers, not only within the order, but also outside the order. Now imagine discussing about the concept of nobility in early modern Europe, what meant truly, with all the fragmentation in different states. Think just to Italy, what a mess it was from this point of view. So these documents, they offer us from different perspectives another unique original perspective on the history of Europe, of social mobility, lands, properties, and diplomacy, politics. The order was embedded in it. So these are all can tell us a lot.
Yeah, and I wonder, do we know at what point young men would join the order? I'm assuming this is a purely male order. So, do we know at what point they would join? Would they join when they were very young, or would they be placed there when they're a bit older? And therefore, would they be educated by the order as well, or would they actually come with an education and skills that the order could use?
It is, first of all, a male order, but there is also a female branch with some nuns. Not so many in comparison, but with some nuns. Some of them still alive, still functioning in a way. But yes, it was mostly a male order. And to join the order, you could join as a minor. It was an exception to the rule, against payment always, of course. You could join as a minor as one of the pages of the Grand Masters, I paggi, we call them, in the original documents. It's one of the pages of the Grand Master. Or you could join with a major age and undertake, first of all, 1 year of novitiate. It was still, a religious order. And after this, at least 4 caravans that were these missions at sea against, the Ottoman attacks, for example, at least 4 of them, and 5 years of residence in the main convent. After that, the cursus honorum of the knight could have been completely different, He could, for example, move in one of the peripheral properties, in one of the priories or commendaries, and became a commander, then a bailiff. So all of these, technical terms, they are part of the different ranks inside the order. Or he could, for example, stay within the main convent and undertake his own career there, for example, becoming even a Grand Master. Why not? So they were trained by the order in the year of novitiate, especially to go at war, of course. But we also know we are actually now studying also the collections of books, not only archives preserved at the National Library of Malta today. And they are, just depicting the profile of the ideal knight in a way, studying and reading about everything from mathematics to literature to history, of course, always, to, biology, medicine. A lot of these, treatises are preserved there. So they were basically the noblemen of the medieval and then early modern Europe. So they had their own, very vast culture as well, embedded then in the mission of the order.
I have one more historical question before we talk about your work in the archives. So just one more historical question. So when the order had these properties around Europe, would they set up infirmaries in these places? So was this in a sense a kind of network of healthcare, not just the Sacra Infermaria in Malta?
Absolutely. The order was and still is in a way a network, put in place a network of very small hospitals attached to these properties called commanderies again. So we have to imagine that one of these commanderies was composed by a church, usually, the building where the knight commander used to live, lands with very, very rich production of fruits, oil, and everything, and in most of the cases, a small hospital. That's why strategically all of these commanderies were placed on the pilgrimage ways. Like, for example, the Via Francigena, we have many of them, going, of course, on all the pathways of pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, or to Santiago de Compostela, and all of these different. Yes, so it's very fascinating. It's truly a network of hospitals to fulfill this mission, basically. Yes.
Let's come to your own work and the process that you began with your postgraduate work of actually, once you had discovered the order and discovered these archives, from people outside of archives, I think don't necessarily understand what goes into archive. We know that historical documents go into archives, but actually the archival science and what that archival science shows us and how it is that you carry out those tasks as archivists. Tell us about that side of your work in the archives of the Order of Malta.
Well, it was, I think, the most fascinating encounter in my life when I discovered the archives of the Order in the actual headquarters of the Order in Rome. Because, just a parenthesis, after Malta in 1798, with the arrival of the French Republican Army, the Order was well dismembered, and an handful of knights managed to reconstruct the Order from, actually starting from the documents, but this is a bit of a spoiler, and moving them into Rome in 1834, where they are still today in a different legal vest. So as a student, this is a story that I love sharing with, not only with colleagues, but also with my own students today. I just encountered the Order by going for research in their own archives in the main headquarters in Rome, in Via Condotti. It's a beautiful building near Piazza di Spagna, so even the context, it's quite amazing, every day entering the door of these amazing archives in that context means something as well. Well, these archives were completely, I was very, very lucky because nobody entered from the standpoint as an archivist, beside, of course, the archivist working there, but, taking care mostly of contemporary records. The historical section of the archives were never explored. So I was assigned just the task of delving into the correspondence of one of the ambassadors, 3 of them actually, ambassadors of the Order to the Holy See that today is the Vatican, of course, that was placed there actually, because that building was also the seat of the embassy of the Order to the Vatican. And, just delving through this correspondence and opening boxes by boxes, these documents were all nicely fit and archival preservation boxes. So everything was amazingly preserved. But then opening these boxes, I discovered pure chaos. Nothing was in order at the order. That's quite of a thing. Nothing was in order. Everything was pure chaos. And I was a very, very young archivist, my own experience. It was the first experience in an archive, actually, working in an autonomous way as a researcher, a very young researcher. And it was amazing to discover that within those boxes, there was not just one archive, but 5 different archives and some collections added later, all mixed up together and preserved. This happened, of course, in the 50s of the 20th century, mixed together according to outdated criteria, like they were, a library rearranged according to topics. While as archivists, we know that we have to respect the provenance of the records and reconstruct the archival creator of these records in order to rearrange them properly. So on one side, this was the first encounter. On the other side, even a bit on a personal note that actually influenced very much also my own methodology. In a way, I grew up with the order there as well. And this is very fascinating because you have to consider that I was working within the walls in the same place where the order still lives, basically. So my own object of research was living there next to me, in the room next to me. So on one side, this it is pure fascination. That's true. But on the other side, we also know that we need to put a bit of distance between us and the object of our research. And so it was the first very hard exercise as a scholar, Loving, the history of the order and all the rest, living with the order, but being a scholar. And adopting, scientific methodology, of course, to face this chaos without, any kind of romanticism about the institution you are studying about. So methodology, it was quite complicated because, of course, I had to adopt, first of all, a case study approach, also to delve into all of these, records. And actually, then I developed this methodology with my PhD, focusing on these proofs of nobility that I just mentioned as one of the main archival procedures. And from that particular case study, I started understanding all the archival dynamics and procedures and the relationship of the order with other institutions that we could not anymore understand because of the state in which the archives were. At all. Part of this history was completely lost. And actually, one of the main discovery, beside rearranging, because then I was hired also for a project there as an archivist, beside my 2 dissertations, to rearrange the historical fonts. But the main discovery of my PhD actually thesis was that after the loss of the island of Malta in 1798, this handful, of knights migrated to Italy in order to escape La Furia Francese, as we say, the French. They managed to reacquire part of their own records from Malta, to bring them to Italy with them, and then to move to Rome in 1834, bringing the archives with the new convent in order to recreate the order from their own ashes. The first priority for them was recovering as much as they could of their own documents. And this, especially to historians, it tells you everything. From where do you start when you have to go through major changes, or where you have to prove that you still exist and you have an identity and you had a long past, actually, glorious or not. It depends as well. But from where do you start? You start from your own archives. And this is I think, the story of the order. And then these archives were, again, merged together with the others in this context, an archival context in Rome called Magistral Archives, the archives of the magistri, the place of the Grand Master, the head of the order.
Understood. So, in fact, then the archives have gone through sort of 2 traumas in a way. The first trauma in 1798 when the French arrived on the island of Malta and the order was scattered. And then a second trauma when the remains of archives from the order were brought together, and because the archival science wasn't especially well developed, actually these things were sort of mixed up, put in a pot and stirred around and brought together, but in a way that made them much more difficult to use as historical documents.
To use and to understand, absolutely. And as an archivist, the main question is always, how can I create accessibility to other users? From chaos to accessibility. And it is a long and very hard and painful pathway, but it is our own job. And consider also that why we are historians of the records as well, why it is so important to study the records by themselves in the context of the archival creator, in this case, the order. But also consider that because of these two traumas, especially the first one after the loss of Malta, the archives that stayed in Malta, remained there, they followed a new pathway in comparison to the order. So it's another history again. And this is why it's so important to teach them also at university level in Malta today. This story is then again very much intertwined with the local context, that is the Maltese scenario, archival scenario there. So that's why it's so important to always study not only pure institutional history or social and cultural history, of course, extremely important, but also the history of the documents, because sometimes it's completely independent. It becomes completely independent from the one of the creator. And even if it is an historical archive, it's still a living body. So everything can happen. And accessibility is not provided once. And, we have to catalog again because new things might come up and a new understanding can be provided as well to the users.
You've just evoked how the archives are used in the education of students. And I want to come to this topic. But before we get there, I think there's two other things to ask you about. How exactly did you reconstruct the archives? And then another question really is about sort of the digital dimension of that reconstruction, but also of the question of accessibility as well.
Sure. So from a methodological point of view, I started from this particular case study, the proofs on nobility preserved in Rome at Magistral Archives there in the actual headquarters of the order. And then, in parallel, I started studying all the statutes and regulations and laws of the order in order to understand which was then the gap, especially between the rule and the practice, in a way, so between the statutes and the regulations of the order and the actual documents, the proofs of nobility. And then I worked a lot on both quantitative and qualitative, research. So I made a census of all of these documents that were scattered in more than 2,000 boxes. And I found 1,000 proofs on nobility and almost 500 genealogical trees that were completely torn out of the volumes for collective menu. So it was quite of a disaster. And I started studying, the old archival reference codes. Just the codes, what we call the segnatura, the collocations, the archival collocations, the historical ones. And actually, on these volumes, these proofs and these genealogical trees, there were many. So through the study and comparison of these different archival reference codes, I managed to understand and to go back into the different rearrangements that these proofs and also the rest of the archive, in a way, went through during the centuries. Not only in the 19th and 20th century, but also before. And since many of these archival collocations matched with some of them, with many of the proofs of nobility preserved in Malta, I managed to understand that part of these records were just moved out from Malta for different reasons. And, just matching the different, archival codes by similarity, they were basically the same. And then I also discovered some of the old inventories of of these knights, especially the Italian ones, preserved at Magistral Archives in Rome, that proved this movement of material. From that, of course, I managed also to understand the different other series of records in the archive, and to reconstruct all of these different rearrangements and basically the history of the Roman repository, the Roman archive, the archive in Rome, and also the one in Malta, because they were strictly connected. This was the most important, let's say, methodological pathway I followed. On the other side, of course, accessibility from an archival point of view, it's mostly provided with research and then cataloging. That is not just a mechanical, of course, operation. It implies all of this research behind. So it's quite complex as well. And since we are here discussing about the reconstruction, we cannot reconstruct this physically. We cannot intervene because it will be not reversible in a way, and we cannot do that. We cannot intervene physically. So the only way to reconstruct this amazing archival history, it is virtually. And I'm very, very grateful to the Malta Study Center and my dear colleague, Dr. Daniel Gullo, is the director of the center. This is a no-profit American organization devoted to the digitization and digital preservation of records records of the order, related to the order or to Malta as well. And I'm involved in all of these digitization projects all around Malta and also Italy to recover and virtually reconstruct this lost cultural heritage, this lost, forgotten, let's say, archival history. And this, beside providing digital preservation, it mainly provides accessibility through actually a virtual platform all over the world to all the users for free.
We'll get the link to that and put it in the description below below this podcast when it goes on YouTube, so people will be able to click through and look at those documents there. So that's how you're providing accessibility. And I guess as well that when it comes to cataloging, all that historical work that you talked about was necessary, not to create, as it were, a list of themes, but to know what the kinds of documents, the genre of documents that will go into that archive, and therefore, as it were, to keep all those similar sorts of documents together, grouped together, be it correspondence or the proofs of nobility that you talked about, or whatever it might be.
Yes, especially respecting the hierarchical structure of the archive and the way in which the order decided to originally preserve and rearrange those records, not to study the record-keeping system of these different, offices of the order, the central convent, these peripheral units, and all the rest. That's very important, because then we use international standards for description, but using a standard also has some, issues, challenges. The risk of making information flat, to lose certain kind of information that is extremely, extremely important and essential to explain this. So cataloging is an intellectual operation. It's not just a mechanical one. So besides representing the archive in the structure in which it was, at least in the last, original rearrangements provided by the order, the shape given by the archival creator, we also have to pay attention to all of these, dynamics, and to clarify always which were the different layers of rearrangement, and also why they were made in a way, from which were the reasons or the periods in which they happened as well. So justifying all of these data in our cataloging, we provide another, perspective as well on the history of the archive, but also on the history of the institution, and the history as well of the holding institutions keeping this material. That is another amazing, fascinating story that we have to take always into consideration. How we, for example, preserve or describe, or we historically organized archives in Italy is completely different from Malta or from the UK. So even the, history of the holding institutions of our country, of our own countries, influence, in a way, of course, the keeping of the material and the way in which they were previously organized as well.
Okay. let's turn our minds towards education and the use of the archives in education. Um, you've told us so far beautifully a lot about the history of the Order of Malta. You've told us also now quite a lot about the, as it were, the history of the archives of the Order of Malta and how that history has been tempestuous at times, and the efforts that you and your colleagues have gone to restore order, reconstruct the archives, and make the archives accessible. So let's come to education in the archives, and the students you have today are coming to your programs to do studies in archival science, but they're also looking at an extraordinary institution which is so deeply connected to the history of the island as well. So what is the role of those archives in this education?
Yes, well, I'm very lucky because in the last 2 years with my department, my colleagues, we actually reformed our own Bachelor in Information and Knowledge Science. And we created 2 new masters, one in archives and another one in libraries, in order to provide, again, to our students the right training, both at international and, national level. And teaching the archival history and institutional history of the order is, of course, an essential part of the history of the island, not the first central government before the state, actually. And it was, at least this was the first year, incredibly important because our duty is to equip our own students with the right knowledge to interpret all of these massive chaos is still there, at the National Library of Malta, and very difficult to access and also very difficult to communicate. And beside the history itself of the order and the archives of the order, these archives are intertwined with the local context, as we were discussing, the Maltese one. And what we found very missing still is that being Malta a very young country, just independent after 170 years of colonial domination, it's still so young, and the construction of the institutions of the state, like the holding institutions, archives and libraries, it's still a work in progress. And so studying the history of these archives, these fonts, these collections, also equip the students with a sort of a sense of what happened in the island during the last centuries, and how then these collections were arranged and rearranged and why. For example, some of the archives of the order were arranged in artificial sections called treasury, just because, of course, the British government needed to accumulate together certain records to manage properties in Malta. So there are other hidden stories behind the way in which the archives of the order were arranged later on, independently from the original archival creator that was in Rome at that time. So discovering all of these hidden stories, it tells you a lot about your own country. And it is also a matter of responsibility. Being information professionals, our own students will have to provide, again, accessibility and also rediscover the complexity of these histories and the history of the holding institutions in Malta, archives and libraries. I believe this is one of the most important things because archives, again, our own cultural heritage, also, of course, museums, archives and libraries, they make the identity of a state as well, in a way. So investigating this story helps for sure to build a state that is still, a work in progress, being a very young place.
Yeah, as I said, I think this is very important. One of the key things about history, as I often tell my students, is that it's the study of the complexity of people and situations over time. And actually, the failure to engage with that complexity has consequences for individuals, but also for societies as well, and has consequences certainly for harmony between people, the ability of different communities to understand where each other comes from. Here at Aston University, we've been recently doing some projects on the diaspora from India after Indian partition, because that diaspora has now become an integral part of the demographics of Birmingham, but not just the demographics in some sort of scientific sense, but just the lived history of Birmingham in the last few decades has now become entwined with that story of Indian partition and the legacy of Indian partition as well. And all these events, all these themes leave, as it were, like a strata of experience, like an archival deposit in a way, in the memory of the city and so on. But I can see there are clear parallels here with Malta, which, like Britain, is an island and therefore has been continually occupied by different people coming from all sorts of different places. I mean, I think, when people think about Malta these days, in Britain, they maybe have a vague idea of it being a small island in the Mediterranean that the British once occupied. But in fact, it's this multi-layered society, history, multi-layered language. And so I can imagine that archival education and historic education is actually a great, has the potential to be a great social solvent as well.
Absolutely. And this complexity, Brian, is the beauty of it. It's the beauty of Malta, being so complex, sometimes fragmented or full of continuities. And its archives are mostly about the community as well. All of these communities, plural, who lived and still live in Malta. And as information professionals, archivists and librarians, we have the duty to rediscover it and to communicate it, for sure. And we also have to recognize, and this is one of the first things I always share with the students, that we are activists in a way, and we are active shapers of this memory with our own intervention and with our own, research and cataloging and everything, with our own operations. We are active shapers of this memory. We have to recognize our own role, and we have to protect it as well, to advocate for the profession, not within the context. All of us, we have to do that, archivists, librarians, curators, historians, because sometimes the world tends to forget our own role. It's how important also our own role is in society. So this is the first thing. We have to fight for this. That's very important. And our students they did a wonderful job during these first years of their own master and bachelor, recognizing it. We are actually creating a society of archivists and librarians, students of archival and library science now in Malta, to give new life to this aspect of the university studies as well.
That's amazing. So, Valeria, you've brought us full circle, really, round to Malta in the present day. But I think the path that you've led us on there is really extraordinary, going back right to the 11th century and the founding of the order. The fact that the order itself travelled through the Mediterranean basin, and then finally down to Malta. The move to Italy, and then your own work, and taking all of that work then back to Malta as a key, as a key which has the potential to unlock some contemporary questions for students that are engaging with those materials and thinking carefully about how it is that we constitute archives and how it is that we constitute histories along the way. Let me ask you in conclusion about the future, and where is your work going next?
Well, on a personal level, I hope I will manage to write my monograph as soon as possible. But in the near future, with the Department of History of the University of Malta and the Malta Study Center and the support of the State Archive of Florence as well, we are planning in Florence the first winter school to study the archives and institutions of the Order of St. John. So you are all invited to join if you like. with a lot of hands-on sessions and, a lot of site visits. It will be a new adventure. So please join us.
And that will be in Florence next year?
Next year, it will be beginning of February 2024. So yes, just next year in collaboration with all of these institutions. So
fantastic.
That's the plan.
And so to have information about that, we just need to keep our eye presumably on the page of the archives in Malta, and then we can book our tickets. That's fantastic, Valeria. Thank you so much for your work. First of all, for your work in such a tremendously important historical archive, one that sheds an amazing light on the history of hospitals, the history of healthcare, and also for sharing with us your expertise about the whole problem of archives and the sorts of challenges that archivists like yourself have faced as they preserve and curate histories for us. Thank you very much for talking to us, and good luck with all your projects there.
Thank you, Brian, very much. Thank you, everyone. It was such a pleasure. Thank you.